समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Welcome to the Worldview with Swasti. Today we are going to be turning to a technology that has acquired a new strategic urgency, and I am talking about civil nuclear energy. As you know, that the Hormuz crisis has laid bare the energy vulnerabilities of almost everybody, including of India. And against this backdrop, I think nuclear power is returning to the center of the global energy conversation, not merely as a low carbon source of electricity, but as an instrument of energy security and strategic resilience. And in this regard, I am sure that you've heard about small modular reactors and how the government is pushing for SMRs and how it is now attracting fresh investment. Now, clearly, I think countries are reassessing uranium supply chains and a lot of other details. But to walk you through this very important critical piece, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Henry Tillman. Dr. Henry Tillman is an industry expert. He's also been lecturing at Cambridge. He heads several, I would say, commercial advisories. But I think the couple of things that I need to mention to introduce all of you to him is that he is associated with Asia Vessel Research and INR Global, which is a UAE-based company that works on research and renewables and so on. And interestingly, he's also COO of the London-based Critical Minerals Advisory that focuses on critical minerals. Remember, they are very important for nuclear energy, and also, on other aspects of small modular reactors. Beyond that, Dr. Tillman has been focusing on Russia and China, particularly on China, and that makes his expertise particularly useful for us here in New Delhi. So without further ado, let me welcome you once again to the Worldview, and let's dive straight in. Henry, what a pleasure to welcome you.
Thank you for having me on, Swasti. It's a pleasure. It's an important conversation.
Right. Yes, indeed, it is a very important conversation. So let's just start with the first and the more generic part of your specialization. So help us understand the larger picture. But the thing that is very clear is that nuclear power, I think, has experienced several cycles of enthusiasm and hesitation, right? What really explains its present revival? Of course, decarbonization is one, but it's also about sort of protecting countries against all these vulnerabilities that come with hydrocarbons supply chains, isn't it? So let's just hear from you of what really makes nuclear power such a strategic necessity today.
I think what you're talking about is the acceleration of this all of a sudden is what you're talking about. So I think we just take a couple of steps back. So first of all, if you look at our IRANA research website, it shows COP28. And COP28 is when they decided 29 countries signed an agreement to treble the use of safe nuclear power from 2020 to 2050. 29 countries signed up at the time in 2023. In 2024, that went to 33 countries. In 2024, you had a number of major banks say we're going to finance this, global banks. And in 2025, you have a number of corporations that signed up and said we're going to sponsor this. So treble the amount of nuclear power globally, yes. So basically 30% of the world will be powered by nuclear power by 2050. That's a global standard, number one. Number two is the demand or AI demand is so great. So there's such a huge demand for SMRs to power AI. We'll talk about that a little later in the process. And then third, we shouldn't forget shipping, because the shipping from a European perspective is now being governed to say, let's dial this back, everybody. That heavy crude used to power these ships produces 3.5% of the world's CO2. So as you move to shipping-based SMRs as well, the goal is to clean up the environment from a shipping point of view as well. So you've got macro levels at the country on land-based SMRs, nuclear, not just SMRs. You've got shipping regulators saying you must clean up your stuff here, right, over a period of time, and a lot shorter than 2050. And of course, you have the AI demands, which are saying, wait a minute, we have to power all this stuff. So you have all three forces, plus what you've just said, Hormuz, another ways of looking at this supply chain uncertainty for energy. So all those things are contributing. But I think it's important to remember, India first noticed this in 1953. The U.S. first launched safe nuclear power in 1953 with the Eisenhower Safe Atoms program. And in fact, thorium, which we'll come on to later, was first announced as presented by Teller, the Standard Oil in 1959, where he said to Standard Oil, we have a problem with CO2, and here's a way to solve it, safe nuclear. So this has been around for a long time, but what's accelerating is all the things we just talked about before. So you're right, acceleration is happening, and finally, I would say.
Right. So, Henry, you also bring, 3 to 4 decades of experience, and I would say industry experience that really counts, because everybody is sort of convinced with the strategic logic and the economic necessity. But I think where you really need to sort of look into the details is where the industry and the expertise of the industry comes in. Now, first, we are going to definitely be talking about a lot of aspects. You mentioned AI, the SMRs and shipping, etc. We're going to come to that. But first, let me just ask you this question straight away. Is nuclear energy, really a low carbon alternative? And another question that grapples, I think, almost everybody that, that is listening to us now is that, is nuclear energy really safe? Because we have seen, major disasters such as the Chernobyl, we have seen Fukushima, etc. Help us sort of, walk us through these two aspects that I just mentioned.
This is a critical piece, and this is the question that people are asking in many countries. And it's what's slowing the development of SMRs or nuclear in many countries. My friends in Malaysia talk about this, and of course India has the same issue. If you're, I raised 4 children. So if you're a family working on raising children, you have other things to worry about besides what's this about. So I'll try and make this simple. With Fukushima, so there are Gen 1, Gen 2 reactors were the original reactors that you're talking about. So Fukushima was a Gen 2 reactor. Gen 2 reactors were not regulated globally, number one. So what we're having are Gen 3 reactors, and China is the only place in the world currently with a Gen 4 reactor, although Russia is getting close to a Gen 4 reactor, and so is India. But so on Gen 3 reactors, you can't have a Fukushima accident. So when a Gen 3 reactor, Fukushima happened, it was shut down automatically. So the people couldn't get into Fukushima to shut it down because the power shut down. So that shuts down automatically, number one. Number two, that molten core gets held in a separate basket it falls into. So you have 72 hours to get into it. So Fukushima can't happen again in a Gen 3 reactor. So whatever happened before cannot happen with this. And when we get into thorium, we'll talk about that, because thorium cannot explode. Can't explode.
All right, yes.
We'll get into thorium a bit later. So the current Gen 3 reactors being built around the world, either on the land, or smaller SMRs. Well, Gen 2 versus Gen 3 is critical for people to understand. That what happened in Fukushima cannot happen in Gen 3 reactors. That's where we are today.
So thanks for elaborating on the fact that whatever happened at Fukushima cannot happen again, because we have basically evolved. The generation of the reactors have evolved, and the Gen 3 reactors do not really function anymore. Is that what you're trying to say? And the world has moved on to, better quality reactors?
What I'm trying to say is the protections around a Gen 2 versus a Gen 3 reactor. A Gen 2 reactor, when Fukushima happened, they couldn't staff couldn't get into the reactor because there was no power. So that's what the core melted down. In today's world, a Gen 3 reactor, it shuts down automatically.
Oh,
There's
all
no
right.
delay for someone shutting it down. It shuts itself down, number one. Number two, the core element of that reactor goes into a separate holding area. So what happened in Fukushima cannot happen in a Gen 3 reactor. And these are all now regulated. The Gen 2 reactors were not regulated.
All right, so two very important points that the Gen 3 reactors now will automatically shut down. So what happened at Fukushima cannot be repeated. And back then, things were not regulated as much as they are now. So that is a point which is well made and well taken, Henry. Can we now, get to the second part of this question that I mentioned about this being a low carbon alternative? Because, the SMRs, particularly when we talk about the small modular reactors, and I will also ask you to tell the audience the difference between traditional, large reactors and the small modular reactors and why they need it all. But let that be the next question. For now, are they really low carbon alternatives? Because the waste management really remains to be an issue. So, what are your thoughts on that?
That's as usual. It's a very lengthy, it's a very multi-layered question. So let's take this one step at a time. So,
Okay.
in terms of waste processing, France leads the world of waste processing, nuclear waste processing, and Russia is also making inroads into waste processing. And the newest reactors, which are not yet publicly available, are actually utilizing some of that old waste to power the reactors going forward. That's not for today's discussion, but that's developing over time. We'll talk about Copenhagen atomics a little bit later, but some of these reactors actually use that waste as part of the fissile material going forward. Not yet, but they're not far away, but it's coming. So you're right about historical, but again, we're not talking about historical, we're now talking about today going forward. So, and when we get to thorium reactors, which we'll get to, yes, that's a 98% burn with a 2% waste and with a 200-year shelf life, not 10,000-year shelf life.
No, that's a very important distinction. And, particularly for us in India, this is very significant, Henry, as because I'm sure, much of your work has been on, Southeast Asia and Asia. So, you know that India has one of the world's largest, in fact, the largest thorium reserves. And our three-stage nuclear program is to get to sort of using the, thorium reactors instead of uranium that we are doing right away. But let me circle back and ask you something more fundamental. Why do we have this sudden need for the SMRs? I mean, the small modular part. So, what is small about the small modular part? What is modular about it, and how are they different from the traditional reactors?
Well, that's also, as usual, a very good question. So, the small modular reactors are things that really run from sort of 30 megawatts to 300 megawatts versus the multi gigawatt big power plants you're talking about. And they're used situational use. So some of these you're talking about are 10 megawatts to power single data centers that China's building right now, or some other places are starting to build. So the need is so great for the AI, as I talked about before, because many of these countries, like we just did profiles for Malaysia and Thailand in the last 6 months, and these are high growth countries digitizing, right? And you've got to have them power those places, right? And the big U.S. players, the hyper players in the U.S., hyperscalers, they need AI. So there's all kinds of different sizes in SMRs, right? They could be, or you could string them together. For example, what Russia's doing in Uzbekistan, there's 6 SMRs strung together at 330 megs each to get to, 2 gigawatts of power. China's doing the same thing with several of theirs. UK's doing 3 SMRs to bring those, to bring them together in a cluster. So there's various different sizes used in various different ways. That's the beauty of them, right? You can make it as small or as large as possible, as functional as possible. Copenhagen atomics is 100 megawatts, right? So each one of these are for different sizes. China's one, China a bit later, is 100 megawatts, which will power 500,000 households, right? That's pretty for 100 megawatts.
Yeah.
So you can see they're all different sizes for different shapes, and that's the beauty of them. So as this all rolls out, this is all happening very quickly. There'll be all different types of producers in developing of different sizes. I hope that's clear. There's no one size fits all. You can make it bespoke for each use. Make sense?
Right. Yeah, of course, it makes sense. And since we are talking about small modular reactors, I think there's another thing that comes to fore, which is that while everybody is talking about the utility of the SMRs, and you also alluded to so many of those, however, what are the challenges? I mean, okay, point taken that one size wouldn't fit all, but what are the challenges? And please tell us more about from the the perspective of Southeast Asian and Asian ecosystem, because that's where we are. All right. So there could be a technological superpower that could be leading in the innovation part. But how does it sort of translate into real time, ground based challenges when it comes to SMRs?
Everyone will want to say, gee, it's about the critical minerals and how do we get them and all that. That's all true. That's not what I see. I'm going to give you a different answer. I see education as the challenge, a lack of people. So, one of my businesses, as you rightfully point out, is critical minerals in Central Asia and in North Africa. And yes, I understand all that. So I understand the needs for securing those critical minerals with people they want to work with as partners, not as owners. That's all true. Those are challenges. Supply chains are challenges, as you would know. I think the biggest challenge is education. So what you have, I attended in June a summit on SMRs, and there was a discussion between the floor and someone on this, an educator in the audience, about education and how that's built over a period of time, etc. And I said, well, have you thought about looking at the Rosatom model of educating people for a number of years before you actually start working with them? Because these education programs go back years before that happens. His response was, "What's Rosatom?" This is our educator to educate people here, right? So there's a dearth of this stuff, because what you've rightly pointed out is a disconnect by the need for this stuff. Suddenly, oh my goodness, we have all this AI power, and how are we going to drive it? How are we going to power this stuff, right? Technology, how are we going to power it? And the lack of people understanding all this. So it's a huge gap to do this, and I find that the biggest challenge. And so that's why places like Rosatom have been around for so many years, or China, the best of their ecosystem. These countries have worked for years training people in this in their own languages. And I'd say another good example, and I'm not bothered by people that think there's only one or two choices. That's not true, because basically Argentina's building one with the local people of Argentina and the money from the USA. That's launched earlier in July. Korean partnership a year ago, which we wrote about, a partnership between two Korean companies with the UAE, a large nuclear reactor, now building SMRs out of that. One Korean company has, I think, 5,000 people trained in nuclear power training. They learned in that process. And another one of the South Korean companies was a specialist at SMR, if you will, building modular reactors, building piece by piece.
Yeah.
So as more of these things get built, there's more and more expertise building on but the biggest disconnect, in my opinion, is what I just said to you. The big need to, as fast as possible, the lack of training. It just takes time to build that. And I don't know I think India's been aware of this since the 1950s. I mean, that thorium, India was aware of that back in the 1950s. So was China and Russia, yes, and France, through Canada. I mean, my children are Canadian. So this is all, people are all aware of this. It's just now there's this need to go as fast as possible, but the lack is the training. And the training starts in messages like this, because you're training people as the recipients of this, listen to the story.
Indeed, Henry. And I remember when we were having earlier our conversation about, and I was, requesting you to come for the podcast, and I could really see how moved you were with the knowledge production around the subject. And you said that how important it is to actually create the knowledge and awareness, and I was quite actually moved by that as well. You mentioned a few countries when you were answering my previous question on small modular reactors and the challenges. And you mentioned the supply chains. And for now, right now, it's about building more diversified, even from India's perspective. I think the key is to basically build more resilient supply chains of uranium. And we've been getting it from a host of countries, including Russia, Kazakhstan, also Canada, now Australia. The Prime Minister was recently in Australia and signed an agreement on getting Australian uranium, etc. help us just understand how much uranium is there. And I ask you this question because we all understand from a scientific perspective that it is better to graduate to thorium because the waste is much lesser, etc. Where are we in that process, right? Everybody right now needs uranium. How much uranium do we have to exploit for that? And then how are we taking care of the waste management? What are the efforts being made at the global level? Also fine tune, as much as you want to really make that transition to thorium.
I'd like to raise it one level above that. We now live
All
in a
right.
multipolar world, which means everybody has a vote. Yes, and so what's happening in the world, and we see in critical minerals, or indeed large infrastructure projects, is the ability to cooperate across countries, across product lines. It's partnerships. So what India has done is partnered, as you said, with Australia with uranium, yes,
Yeah.
with Canada with uranium, right, with Chemico, etc. A partnership with Indonesia recently in nickel. And you look
Yeah.
at all these, and it's not just that's just India. The same is true with other countries, right? So we work, as I told you, in our critical minerals business, we work in those other countries. I can tell you, all these countries are being bombarded with parties saying we just want to buy X, Y, Z from you, but the answer is we want a partnership. So the countries, all countries in the world are now saying critical minerals come under us as a government to decide who we want to partner with. It's part of a partnership relationship. So some of the bankers that previously involved in this business were all about doing trades or investments. Yes, as investment bankers or commercial bankers. Now it's all about the country saying, sorry, this is about our critical minerals, and we'll choose how we do those. So these are strategic partnerships, number one. Number two, they're long-term partnerships. If you get involved with uranium or nuclear, these are long-term. SMRs, 15 years. A large nuclear reactor, 60 years. And across the power plants, you therefore can power lots of things like a smart city platform, yes, ultimately medical platforms. So it's much bigger than just using this bit. So yes, uranium is the current play. So is lithium. So is lithium with batteries. But recently, China announced, even in the last 2 weeks, they've come up with a sodium battery. Sodium battery. So
Okay.
if that's true, why do we need lithium anymore, or why do we need cobalt anymore in that regard? Because what you have is it's huge amount of innovation happening across the world in loads of different forms, whether it's nuclear power or green hydrogen or whatever. That's one of the fun things about being in the energy business, because there's so much innovation happening. So there's no one answer today. So you look at this if I'm running a country, our advice is always look at this over what period of time. But it starts with a strategic partnership over critical minerals, and those are country-to-country relationships. And Modi's done a great job. I'm a huge supporter of Modi. He's done a great job.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, great, fine. So, since you mentioned Prime Minister Modi and all his efforts with the current push for SMRs, and obviously a lot of money has been committed to its development, that is going to be the next big thing. I think everybody in the strategic community sort of shares that view. Let me ask you a little bit about India. I think one part of this discussion, whether we're talking about a country as huge as India or other countries in our neighborhoods, particularly Southeast Asian countries, you mentioned Indonesia, you mentioned Malaysia, these countries that are growing fast and also have a huge energy need and are dependent, as much as India. However, the question is that, how do you look at foreign collaboration? How do you look at technology, for example? There's always a tussle, there's always a tension between, innovators that are reluctant to give the transfer of technology. And yet, if you want to produce all this in a time-bound fashion, in a time-efficient fashion, you cannot really rule foreign collaboration out. What's your view on that? I mean, how much of indigenization or localization and building that innovation ecosystem back home, and how much of foreign collaboration? What is the best way to sort of understand this balance and this equilibrium?
The ultimate, so our model in critical minerals is many countries that we just talked about don't have asset management capabilities in their own country. So in order to develop those critical minerals and their processes, you need to form a partnership with a Western player. That's one example in critical minerals of partnerships. But I've sort of mentioned a couple already. So you look at partnerships, you've seen a partnership between two Korean companies and the UAE to then take that model that they built on the ground, that is the largest African power plant currently, to be cooperative going forward. So it's a you're developing it together, basically. There's a lot of partnerships being formed right now. So I understand your point about saying we want to own all this, and ultimately the country will own as I think you just seen with Argentina. It's U.S. private equity firm putting the money in, the $1.2 billion to build the 300 megawatt reactor, but it's Argentinian IP. So so I think in our case, we see that the country with their own critical minerals will want to control the IP 100%. Yes.
Right.
So these are partnerships or financial partnerships or mining partnerships, but the IP is owned by the country.
That was an important point you raised, and we are going to be talking a lot more about partnerships with foreign partners, etc. What is your take on the fact that just like energy, even critical mineral supply chains could be weaponized? I understand you raised this point about partnership and how it was different from a buyer-seller ecosystem of the past, and yet when you look at a country like China, because I know a lot of your work is centered around China, what potential do you see of these supply chains getting weaponized, if at all? Because aren't we living in the era of weaponization where everything and anything can be weaponized?
Our critical minerals business, basically, we work with many of these countries. They don't want any kind of Chinese investors. Our focus in these countries I just told you about is really North Asian investors, so which would be East Asian investors, would be Japan and Korea, and or Gulf investors and or Singaporean investors. So many of the people we work with really right now don't want China because, as I said before, critical minerals, these people want partnerships, and they don't want, whether it's China, US, or Russia, which say, I want 100% control of your critical minerals. They don't want that. They want options. So our model, our advisory model is fine. We understand that. We'll find you partners and we'll play on your terms, just like Argentina's done with the US, investors. Argentina controls the IP, and the U.S. investors put the money in, basically. So that's the structure. It's not a China structure. You're right about China controlling the critical minerals. I think I read a quote by Deng the other day. He made in 1992 saying that we will control critical minerals in 1992. This happened a long
that's right.
Okay, that's a long time ago. So suddenly on the pennies dropped saying, wow, China controls critical minerals. But Deng made that statement in 1992.
Yeah.
Of course. So as a practical matter, we don't see that now. We see people saying we don't want that to happen. We don't want the U.S. controls. We don't want Russia to control us, and we don't want China to control us. We want partners.
Right. I understand that. I mean, in fact, recently, I'm sure you must have noticed the fact that Saudi Arabia and the United States announced a civil nuclear cooperation agreement that was in the making for a long time. And just as it was announced, the very next day, the press secretary said that this is contingent upon Saudi Arabia recognizing the Abraham Accords, which was not an initial condition when the agreement was being negotiated. And that also shows how these things can, go into and walk into trouble if you are dealing with the heavyweights of the world. So I totally get your point on partnerships.
I always think you have to look at the fine point or look at the things that are not said. So, and that's why I don't think these things are not about getting in a hurry. These are long-term partnerships between countries. They know each other as partners, and that's one of the beauties of Asia. It's long-term relationships. It's not transactional. If people are looking at things transactional, you're asking for trouble, in my opinion. But what do I know about politics?
Right. No, that's absolutely right. And I think what anybody would argue, anybody with a strategic sort of bent of mind would argue is that the way forward is to basically develop co-stakes, and not dependencies. I think that's the way forward, and that's been very, very clear. Henry, since you're here, and I have to ask you about your expertise on China. I mean, that's one country that we want to understand better, not just about the usual weaponization, the usual trade wars, the usual, dominance, but also help us understand, when it comes to the small modular reactors, right, the molten salt reactors, thorium-based technologies, where is China with respect to United States, etc.? Where is China, and what is that one or two things that India needs to watch out for?
So first of all, I don't see China versus the U.S. I don't see that. I see the world is multipolar. I just told you about Korea's expertise. Yes, I've mentioned Copenhagen Atomics out of Denmark partnering with Scandinavia. There's lots of other expertise around the world. It's not one v one. I don't see the world that way anymore. I see it multipolar. I first wrote the piece on multipolar in September 22. So I'm 4 years ago on this, okay? So let's talk about China. So the answer is, without having to go through 80 years of history, I'll do it in a minute. So in the U.S., I mentioned before, Eisenhower said we'll get safe atoms, and of course, by Teller then announced at 59. We have a thorium reactor, and it then functioned on a cargo ship between the U.S. between 62 and 72 just fine. They ran onshore experiments in thorium 65 to 69. In 1972, the U.S. and the U.K. locked that technology down from the world. It was functional until 72. It was then locked down from 72 to 2011. After Fukushima, the U.S. unlocked that technology for the world, and the whole world got that technology at the same time. Yes?
Yeah.
Now, what happened at that time is China went to work on that immediately, right? And so in 2011, yes. So it won't surprise you, since China said, let's build the power base first, they weren't focusing on the AI. Well, the West was all over AI because the cloud was in 2008. I think the man who worked on the cloud works with me in the U.S. So the West built the AI and didn't build the power, and China and Russia has built the power and now focusing on the AI. Yes,
Right.
that was the choices. So Gates and terra firma really didn't start looking at SMRs until nuclear power until 2018. Didn't start funding until 2020. That happened here in the UK, by the way, where China was all full bore in 2011. So there, I won't surprise you then. And ironically, you're having this conversation this month. If you've just seen the news in the last few days, Hualong 1 is now functional, and that's 1.2 gigawatts. Linglong 1, which is 100 megawatt, is still not functional. It was supposed to be experimental, but it's not far away. The point is, those are both commercial, and those will both be commercial either later this year or 2027. And we're talking, and as you know what you're doing, your 5 SMRs are 33, some of the others are 33, 35. There's a several year gap, number one. On thorium, the thorium 3s I'm talking about, the thorium TMSR, is functional in 29 by China, and therefore won't be long after that. Yes? So in essence, what you have is a several year gap because China did it first. Everybody else had the same. Actually, the US and UK had this technology in 1953.
Yeah.
Okay, so and why didn't they use it? That's not my decision. But I'm just telling you, China jumped on it immediately because they knew what was in there. And so they, like anything else, in any other industry, those that moves it first, that's the game. So, and now Russia's, working hard to do not only just Gen 4, but also thorium Gen 4. But it's not just those two countries. I mean, as I told you, Copenhagen Atomics is a small SMR player using thorium from Norway, in a partnership with Norway. So it's much broader now. It's not 1v1.
Okay.
Right. In political terms, that's not the case anymore. And Korea, by the way, is the one building ships and maybe the nuclear pieces for the U.S. Icebreakers. So there's all kinds of things going on. It's not
Okay. Yeah, no, I think you elaborated it perfectly well. But since we are mentioning, and discussing China, and you also mentioned Russia, walk us through what kind of a cooperation do China and Russia have on civil nuclear energy? Because of the geopolitical events after the Russia-Ukraine war, you do see that there's a deepening of alliance between Russia and China. There's a no limits partnership, etc., etc. How does that play out, if at all, in the civil nuclear, technology, the reactors, and so on?
Anyway, I'll go back to what I said before. It's about global partnerships. So if you go back, I'm, as you probably know, I'm one of the 3 authors of the 2018 Northern Silk Road, Polar Silk Road documents. Myself, the Chinese government, and some of Iceland, basically. So after 2014, when the first sanctions happened, Russia by definition had to reach out to partners to help fund them because the Western partners are no longer considered acceptable. So that's the first move towards, yes? And that then helped power up Russia LNG for a number of years before the war happened. Yes? So the first thing happened because of U.S. sanctions. The first acceleration happened because of U.S. sanctions. Arguably, the more U.S. sanctions they put on these companies, the more this acceleration happens. By definition, right, for funding point of view. So it's not just the nuclear piece. The nuclear piece is a component of an overall corporate relationship. And I think I don't know the numbers now, but I think President Xi and President Putin have met over 30 times.
Yeah, 40
They're
times
quite
actually.
close.
Yeah.
And so I'd say, and it's not just that. I think it was 24 a couple of years ago, so maybe more than that now. But anyway, I'm not current on the exact numbers.
Yeah.
But it's a substantial number of times, and they continue to meet. And so it's broader than that. It's much broader than that. And of course, look at Russian trade flows with China are now going to 200 million a year, 200 billion a year. So these are across. Again, none of the. If you're sitting on critical minerals, you're sitting on nuclear. These are long-term partnerships across multiple product lines. It's no different how Goldman runs this business, or Morgan Stanley runs this business, or Stan Chart runs this business. We have a relationship with a party. We go multiple product lines for multiple periods of time. It's a partnership. It's not transactional. Right. And the more people want to think of transactional, every country said, not me, not anymore. Here's the deal.
Right.
What do you
all
want
right.
longer term?
Thank you for all your elaborations, Henry. They've been very useful. I think just to wrap up our discussion now, which has touched upon all these dimensions, if I had to ask you to identify this one innovation in civil nuclear technology in the coming years and decades, what would that be?
Well, I thought, as you know, I'm a big proponent of thorium. And one of the senior executives, not the chair of Copenhagen Atomics, recently said in an interview that by 2100, 50% of the world's energy will be powered by thorium, purely on a cost basis. It's so advantageous. And since India is a world leader in thorium ownership, if you will, mineral rights, you're well positioned to deliver on that over that period of time. So a challenge is over to you to do that. But before closing, I'd like to just raise one more point we didn't get to raise today, which is the current state of Rosatom. As you know, Rosatom has been the world leader in floating nuclear power plants. The first one, SMR, in really 2019, 2020. They've led the world the last 6 years in developing this. But recently, because of sanctions and because of the war, the demands of the war and financing of the war, Rosatom has come kind of under difficult times. So the financing has become a question. So you've seen they've had to make moves to reduce the workforce. But more importantly, it's reverberating through the market. So countries are looking at other options, basically. So you've seen in Vietnam signed to do a transaction and build a nuclear power plant with Russia in March, and by June, Vietnam's looking at other options, even Korea as an option. You've seen Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan with Russian, led by Rosatom, and for the financing in question, they're looking at USA or other options as providers of that, China as providers of that. So while in one case we're talking about the future where thorium is going and how fast it's moving, in the other case we see these transitional fuels and transitional players has to stay up with these fast movements. And so Rosatom in the current position, they may have been the leader the last 6 years, but how long does that continue? Or how long does it take before sanctions come off? Or how long does it take them to use Chinese financing? We have to wait to see. But currently, that's the stretch of under countries notice that.
Right. Yeah, that's an important point, and thanks for adding to our knowledge about Rosatom, because of course it's a very important player, and of course Russia is a very important civil nuclear energy partner for India as well. And you were watching Worldview with Swasti. This was Dr. Henry Tillman, industry expert with 3 to 4 decades of experience, an academic with humongous knowledge on civil nuclear technology and critical minerals.
Thank you so much.